The rain wasn't just falling, it was attacking. A relentless, deafening drumbeat against the windshield of Chloe's aging sedan, each drop a tiny explosion of noise that filled the world. The wipers beat a frantic, useless rhythm, smearing the... It whirled into a watery blur of asphalt and the bleeding taillights of the car ahead. Inside, the air was thick with the faint, greasy scent of fryer oil that clung to her waitress uniform, a smell that never seemed to wash out. Her hands, raw and red from a shift spent, plunged into chemical-laden dishwasher steam, gripped the steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity. They were at 10 and 2, a habit from a driving instructor long ago, from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. Her eyes, a tired hazel, were fixed on the winding road ahead, but they weren't truly seeing it. They were seeing the stack of bills on her kitchen table. They were seeing the new, frighteningly expensive inhaler the doctor had prescribed for Leo. They were seeing the clock, ticking relentlessly towards midnight, knowing that each passing minute was a minute stolen from the few hours of sleep she desperately needed before it all began again. The fatigue was a physical weight. A cold stone settled deep in her chest. This drive home through the treacherous forest-lined canyon was the gauntlet she ran every night, a necessary risk between the poverty of her tips and the only thing that mattered, the sanctuary of her son's smile. A sudden, deeper shudder ran through the car as the tires plowed through a near-invisible lake spanning the lane. Chloe's breath hitched, her heart lurching into her throat. She leaned forward, squinting, her world narrowing to the two weak cones of light, her headlights cast against the oppressive gloom. The trees were tall, dark sentinels pressing in from either side, their branches whipping in the wind like frantic arms. And then, light, a pair of brilliant xenon-bright headlights, appeared from the opposite direction, moving with a speed that was arrogant, reckless in this weather. A low-slung sports car, a sliver of polished metal and dark intent. It hit the same sheet of water her sedan had just conquered, but where her old, heavy car had shuddered and settled, the sports car simply gave up. The tires lost all purchase. It ceased to be a car and became a physics experiment. A stone skipping across a black pond. Time seemed to warp, to slow into a series of horrific, silent tableaus. The car spinning, a graceful, macabre ballet. The side-on impact with the guardrail, a shrieking metallic scream that tore through the night, a shower of orange sparks blooming and dying instantly in the rain. The groan of tortured metal as the rail buckled, then gave way. For one terrifying second, the car hung there, nose pointed into the abyss, a poised predator about to strike. Then, with a final sucking crunch of gravel and dirt, it vanished. Over the edge. The silence that followed was more deafening than the crash. It was broken only by the relentless hiss of the rain and the frantic hammering of Chloe's own heart against her ribs. Every thought of Leo, of exhaustion, of the rent, evaporated in the white-hot flood of adrenaline. Her body moved before her mind could process the command. She stomped on the brake, her car skidding slightly before jerking to a halt, her headlights now staring into the gaping, twisted moor where the guardrail had been. Her hands fumbled for the faded orange canvas. Bag on the passenger seat, her emergency kit, a relic from her father who believed in being prepared for anything, a habit she'd never broken. She threw the car into park, left the engine running and the lights on, a lone beacon in the darkness. Shoving the door open. Against the wind, she was instantly drenched, the cold rain a shock that stole her breath. She stumbled to the edge, her cheap sneakers slipping on the wet asphalt. Below was only blackness. A steep, muddy slope littered with jagged rocks and broken pine branches. And then, 20 feet down, the wreck. It was a monstrous, unnatural shape resting on its crushed roof. Steam, or perhaps smoke, hissed from the mangled engine block like the last breath of a dying animal. And underneath the rain, another sound. The steady, ominous drip, drip, drip of fluid, Gasoline. Fear was a cold hand closing around her throat, but she choked it down. There was no room for it. There was only the slope, the mud, and the wreck. A life hanging in the balance. And she was the only thing standing between it and the endless dark dot-turning comma. She began her descent, scrambling down the treacherous incline, grabbing at roots and exposed rocks to slow her fall, her hands scraping on stone, the mud sucking at her shoes, pulling her down toward the nightmare below. The mud was a cold, hungry thing, sucking at her shoes, trying to claim her. Chloe half slid, half fell down the embankment, her hands scrabbling for purchase on wet roots and jagged rocks that tore at her skin. The world narrowed to the steep, treacherous slope and the horrific sculpture of twisted metal at the bottom. Each gasp of air was a lungful of cold rain, and the acrid, terrifying scent of gasoline. The wreck was worse up close. The luxury car was now a contorted tomb of steel and glass. The front end was concertinaed into a shapeless mass, the roof crushed and bowed from the impact of its roll. Steam, or maybe it was smoke, poured from the mangled engine block, hissing. Like an angry serpent, its sound a constant, sinister underscore to the scene. Underneath it was another sound, a low, almost human groaning of settling metal, as if the car itself were in its death throes. The passenger compartment was a nightmare. The windshield was a spiderweb of cracks, smeared with mud and something darker. The driver's side window was gone, shattered into a million glittering diamonds now ground into the mud. And inside, suspended upside down by the taut crush of his seatbelt, was the driver. He was unconscious, his head lolled at a sickening angle against the collapsed roof. A deep, ugly gash on his temple wept a steady stream of blood, tracing a crimson path down his forehead and into his matted hair. His face was pale, waxy, a stark contrast to the dark, vital red. Chloe's training, a basic first aid course taken a lifetime ago when she'd worked at a summer camp, surged to the forefront of her mind, overriding the panic that screamed in. Her veins, scene safety, the smell of gasoline was overpowering. One spark, but she couldn't think about that. ABC, airway, breathing, circulation. "Hey, can you hear me, sir?" Her voice was sharp, loud, cutting through the hiss of steam and the drumming rain. There was no response. His chest rose and fell, but the motion was shallow, ragged. She dropped her kit, yanking it open. Her fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the clasp. She found a wad of sterile gauze and pressed it hard against the wound on his head. The pressure was immediate, the white fabric blooming red like a grotesque flower. "Come on, stay with me. Help is coming. You have to stay with me," she said, her voice a constant, forceful mantra. She was talking to him, to herself, to the storm. It was a lifeline she was throwing into the dark, hoping he would grab on. Beneath her fingers, she felt the exquisite wool of his suit jacket, sodden with rain and blood. It was a fabric she could never afford, a world of tailored seams and silent luxury. Her eyes flickered to his wrist, pinned awkwardly against the roof. A watch, a sleek, complicated piece of machinery with a face that probably cost more than her car. The juxtaposition was jarring. Here, in the mud and the violence, were the trappings of a life so distant from her own, it might as well have been on another planet. A flicker of something bitter and resentful tried to surface, a thought of Leo, of the things she couldn't give him, but she crushed it. There was no room for that here. Her gaze swept the wreckage, looking for any other immediate threats, any other injuries, and then she saw it. His phone had been thrown from the console in the crash. It lay screen up on the collapsed roofliner, just beside his shoulder. The screen was a mosaic of cracks, but the image behind it was clear. A photograph of a young girl, maybe 7 or 8, with a gap-toothed grin and laughing eyes, her hair in 2 messy braids. She was holding a soccer ball, beaming with pure, unadulterated joy. The air left Chloe's lungs. The expensive suit, The watch, they were abstractions. This was not. This was a heart. This was a person who was loved, who loved. This was a child who needed her father to come home. The last vestiges of distance evaporated. This was no longer a rich man in a wrecked car. This was a father. This was someone's whole world. Her resolve hardened into something unbreakable, a diamond forged in the pressure of the storm. She adjusted the gauze, her touch firmer, more sure. "Your daughter," she said, her voice losing its frantic edge, becoming low, compelling, intimate. "She needs you to fight. Do you hear me? You have to fight for her. Squeeze my hand if you can hear me." She wedged her free hand into the wreckage, finding his limp, cold fingers. For a long moment there was nothing. Then the faintest, almost imperceptible pressure, a ghost of a squeeze, a sob of relief caught in her throat. "That's it. Good." "That's good. Just hold on. Keep holding on." She lost all sense of time. The world shrank to the space inside that shattered window, to the rhythm of her own voice, telling him to hold on, to breathe, to think of his daughter's face, to the feel of his pulse under her fingers, a weak, thready flutter against her skin, to the constant, terrifying drip of gasoline onto the wet earth. She was a lone guardian, a statue in the rain, her entire being focused on the single monumental task of keeping this stranger's flame from being extinguished. She didn't hear them at first. The wind and rain masked their approach. But then a new sound woven into the fabric of the storm, faint at first, then growing, swelling into a promise, into a prayer, answered. The distant, high-low wail of sirens. They pierced the night, cutting through the darkness, a symphony of hope. Chloe didn't stop her pressure on the wound. She didn't stop talking. But her head lifted, her eyes looking up toward the broken guardrail far above. Tears she didn't. And no, she'd been holding back, mixed with the rain on her cheeks. "They're here," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Just a little longer. Just hold on a little longer for me. For her." She kept her vigil, a solitary figure in the storm, until the first flashes of red and blue light painted the trees above, and the voices of the paramedics began calling out as they scrambled down the slope toward them. The emergency room was a different kind of storm. It was a cyclone of controlled chaos, a stark, fluorescent-lit world of beeping machines, hurried footsteps, and the low, urgent murmur of voices. The smell of antiseptic was a brutal chemical, clean, that tried and failed to erase the coppery scent of blood and the lingering fear that clung to everyone in the waiting area. Chloe stood there, a sodden, shivering island in the middle of the bustle. Her uniform was plastered to her skin, a map of mud and rainwater pooling at her feet on the linoleum floor. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were stained with dark, dried blood that the hospital's harsh lights made look black. A police officer approached her, his demeanor calm but efficient. He had a notepad, his pen poised. "Ma'am, we understand. You were the first on the scene." Chloe nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. The adrenaline was receding, leaving a vast, hollowed-out exhaustion in its wake. Every second here was a second away from Leo. "I saw it happen. He hydroplaned." She gave her statement in short, clipped sentences. She described the rain, the skid, the impact. She mentioned stopping, calling 911, going down to check. She carefully sculpted the story, sanding down the edges of her own heroism. She was a witness, not a participant. She was just someone who happened to be there. She made it sound simple, a logical sequence of events, not a heart-pounding, terrifying race against death in a gasoline-soaked pit. "And your name, ma'am?" "For the report," the officer asked, his pen hovering. "Chloe," she said, then a deliberate pause. "Just Chloe." She offered no last name, no address, no phone number. She was a ghost in the system, a footnote. The officer looked up, a slight frown on his face, but he didn't press. People in crisis often acted strangely. As she finished, a woman cut through the crowd with the sharp, unstoppable efficiency of a laser. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored pantsuit that seemed absurdly out of place in the ER, her hair pulled back in a severe, perfect bun. She held a smartphone in one hand and a leather folio in the other, her eyes scanning the room before landing on Chloe with unnerving accuracy. This was Eleanor Shaw, Alexander Vance's personal assistant. "Are you the one who was with him?" she asked, her voice not loud, but carrying a tone of unquestionable authority. It wasn't quite gratitude. It was an assessment. Chloe simply nodded again, feeling small and grubby under the woman's clinical gaze. Eleanor's eyes flickered over Chloe's stained uniform, her muddy shoes, and for a fraction of a second, a calculation was made. She opened the folio, extracted a checkbook, and began to write with swift, practiced strokes. The sound of the pen on the paper was sharp and final. "We are deeply grateful for your assistance," she said, her voice smooth as polished glass. She tore the check free and held it out. It was blank, save for a flourishing signature at the bottom. "This is for your troubles. Please fill in whatever number you feel is appropriate for your time and distress." The offer hung in the air. Between them, it was a transaction, a settlement. It was the way this woman's world operated. Every problem had a price. Every emotion could be quantified and cleared from the books. The check was a get-out-of-gratitude free card, a way to neatly package this messy, human incident and file it away. Chloe looked at the check, then at the woman's perfectly composed face. A coldness that had nothing to do with her wet clothes settled in her stomach. She thought of the man's weak grip on her hand, the photograph of his daughter. This felt like a desecration of that sacred, desperate space they had shared in the mud. She didn't shout. She didn't get angry. She simply took a small step back, her hands remaining firmly at her sides. "No," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. "It was not a negotiation. That's not necessary." Eleanor Shaw's composure cracked for a microsecond. Her eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. The pen hesitated. The refusal of money was a variable her algorithm had not accounted for. She was prepared for haggling, for greed, for outrage. She was not prepared for a simple, quiet no. The check remained suspended in the air, a useless, fluttering token. At that moment, the double doors to the trauma bays swung open. A gurney was being rushed through, surrounded by a team of doctors and nurses. On it lay Alexander Vance, pale and unconscious, an oxygen mask over his face, an IV line snaking into his arm. He was surrounded by technology and expertise, but he looked smaller than he had in the car. Stripped of his suit, his watch, his authority, he was just a man, fragile and broken, being wheeled into the unknown. Anonymous. Vulnerable. Chloe watched him disappear through the doors, the sight sealing her decision. Her role here was over. Without another word to the stunned assistant, Chloe turned. She walked away from the bright lights, the beeping machines, the offer of money. She pushed through the hospital's automatic doors and stepped back out into the rain. It felt cleaner out here. She took a deep, shuddering breath of the wet night air and began the long walk to where her old, faithful sedan was parked. She left no name, took no reward. She was a ghost in the rain, her act of profound humanity already being buried under the clinical efficiency of the wealthy, a secret between her, the storm, and the dying man she'd refused to abandon. The fragile peace of the following days shattered with the ping of a single email. It was from the pharmacy, a bland, automated message stating that the claim for Leo's new, stronger corticosteroid inhaler had been denied by their insurance provider. The reason cited was not medically necessary. The words glared from the screen, cold and bureaucratic. Chloe's heart gave a sickening lurch. She'd spent an hour on the phone with the doctor just last week, listening to him explain in grave tones why Leo's old inhaler wasn't cutting it anymore, why his lungs needed this specific, more powerful medication to prevent another terrifying trip to the ER. Medically necessary was the exact phrase he had used. A cold dread, far more potent than any she'd felt on the rainy road, began to seep into her bones. She pictured Leo's face, tight with the effort of drawing breath, the way his small chest would hollow with the struggle. The cost of the inhaler without insurance was a number so astronomical it felt like a typo, a cruel joke. It was more than her monthly rent. Frantic comma she began to search. She scoured the internet for patient assistance programs, for coupons, for any loophole. Her small apartment, usually a haven, felt like a shrinking box of panic. Bills were spread across the kitchen table. Rent, utilities, now this monstrous medical sum, a siege of numbers she couldn't fight back. Every potential lead turned into a dead end. A website that required a year of tax returns she couldn't provide, a charity that had run out of funds. Her browser was a mosaic of her desperation. And then, in a sidebar, nestled between ads for low-interest loans and weight-loss pills, a local news headline caught her eye. Tech titan Alexander Vance survives harrowing canyon crash, saved by mystery Good Samaritan. The breath left her body. It felt like the car had hit her instead. Her hand, trembling slightly, moved the cursor and clicked. The article loaded. There was a picture of him, a professional headshot. Alexander Vance, CEO of Vance Holdings. He was smiling a confident, easy smile, his hair perfectly styled, his suit impeccable. He looked out from the screen like a king surveying his domain. The article was effusive, praising his business acumen, his philanthropy, his vision. It mentioned the crash in dramatic terms, glorifying the unknown hero who had braved the storm to save him before first responders could arrive. But Chloe didn't see any of that. The name alone had struck her with the force of a physical blow. Alexander Vance. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. The sounds of the city outside her window faded into a dull roar. The name echoed in her mind, a key turning in a lock she had sealed shut years ago. And the memories came, not as thoughts, but as visceral, full-sensory flashbacks that ripped her from her kitchen and hurled her into the past. The smell of sawdust and lemon oil, Edison's hardware, her father's store. Not just a store, a kingdom. Sunlight streaming through the front windows, illuminating floating dust motes, dancing above aisles of neatly organized nails, screws, and paint cans. The solid, comforting weight of a hammer in her small hand as her father, his face crinkled in a smile, guided her to hit a nail straight. His pride? "That's my girl," he'd say, his voice warm and sure. The store was his life's work, a testament to hard work and community. It was their future. Then, the cold, the men in suits, the offer. Vance Holdings was looking to consolidate a portfolio of local retail properties. Her father's refusal, polite but firm. This was not for sale. This was his. The pressure that followed. The sudden, mysterious breaches of lease agreements by the building's landlord, a shell company they later learned, owned by Vance Holdings. The delivery delays from suppliers who were suddenly experiencing shortages. The smear campaign in local circulars, painting Edison's as an outdated, overpriced relic. The slow, agonizing strangulation of a small business. The final brutal offer, a fraction of the store's worth, made when they were on their knees. Her father's face, the light in his eyes, extinguished as he signed the papers. The sound of the "closed forever" sign clicking into place on the door for the last time. The silence in the house afterward. The way her father seemed to shrink, his broad shoulders perpetually stooped, his laughter a forgotten language. He was a ghost long before he died. his spirit broken by the cold, impersonal machinery of a corporation that saw his dream as a line item on a balance sheet. Chloe was jerked back to the present. She was standing, though she didn't remember getting up. Her fists were clenched so tightly, her nails were cutting half-moons into her palms. A white-hot fury, ancient and pure, erupted in her chest, burning away the panic, the desperation, the exhaustion. She looked at the man's smiling picture on the screen, the man whose blood had stained her hands, the man she had talked back from the edge of death, the man she had comforted. Nausea rose in her throat, bitter and acidic. She hadn't saved a life. She hadn't performed an act of humanity. She had preserved the monster. The hero she had felt herself to be in the rain, and the mud vanished, obliterated by the devastating truth. In its place stood a fool, a gullible, bleeding-heart fool who had wasted her compassion on the architect of her family's ruin. The man directly responsible for the very desperation that now had her cornered, unable to afford her son's medicine. The fury was a living thing inside her, a storm far more violent than the one that had raged outside her car. It was a fury she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, a fire she'd banked to embers to survive. Now it roared back to life, fed by the image of her broken father and the sound of her son's struggling breath. She had saved Alexander Vance, and the cost of that salvation was going to be paid by her son. The envelope was heavy, the paper stock thick and expensive under her thumb. It felt alien amongst the pile of bills and generic supermarket flyers. Her name and address were printed in a crisp, elegant font. No return address, just a discreet wax seal on the back, an intricate stylized V. Chloe's heart did a slow, hard thud against her ribs. She knew, with a cold, sinking certainty, what it was. She tore it open, her fingers clumsy. Inside was a card, even heavier than the envelope, engraved, not printed. Alexander Vance requests the pleasure of your company at a dinner in gratitude for your courageous actions on the evening of October 26. It listed an address that was synonymous with power and wealth in the city, a penthouse address in a tower that pierced the skyline. The formality of it was a world away from the mud and the gasoline smell. This wasn't a request. It was a summons. His resources, vast and impersonal, had scoured the city and found her. The anonymous hero was anonymous no more. Her first impulse was pure, incandescent rage. She wanted to shred it, to burn it, to hurl it out the window. How dare he? After what he'd done. This gilded invitation felt like the final, grotesque insult. But then her eyes drifted to the inhaler on the kitchen counter, the cheap, ineffective one. She thought of the eviction notice, a pale yellow ghost lurking beneath the other mail. The fury curdled, mixing with a bitter, pragmatic desperation. This wasn't just an invitation. It was an opportunity, a twisted, horrifying opportunity. But an opportunity nonetheless. Perhaps she could confront him, unleash the torrent of anger that had been boiling inside her since she'd seen his name, look him in the eye and tell him exactly who she was, force him to see the wreckage he'd left in his wake beyond that canyon road. Or perhaps she could get what she needed, the money for Leo's medication, a month's rent. It would be a transaction, nothing more. Blood money, but money that would keep a roof over her son's head. The thought shamed her, but the image of Leo struggling to breathe shamed her more. 2 days later, she stood outside the towering building feeling like a trespasser. She wore her one good dress, a simple black shift that felt cheap and inadequate against the soaring marble and glass atrium. A doorman in a uniform more luxurious than anything she owned nodded her toward a private elevator whose doors whispered open at her approach. The ride up was silent, swift, and stomach-lurching, offering a panoramic view of the city lights, spreading out like a field of diamonds, a view of a world she would never belong to. The elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse. The opulence was not just visible, it was a physical presence that pressed against her. The air itself smelled different, like polished wood, exotic flowers, and money. Vast floor-to-ceiling windows presented the entire city as a personal diorama, art that looked like it belonged in museums hung on the walls. The room was a symphony of muted greys, deep blues, and gleaming metallic accents. It was staggeringly beautiful and utterly soulless. A gilded cage, every perfect untouched surface screamed of a life insulated from consequence, from want, from the grubby desperation that defined her own existence. Other guests mingled, holding delicate glasses of champagne. They were all sharp. Suits, elegant dresses, and the easy, confident laughter of people who had never worried about a utility bill. Chloe stood just inside the doorway, a ghost at the feast, her hands clenched at her sides. And then she saw him. Alexander. Vance moved through the room with a slight stiffness, a telltale hint of bruising still visible at his temple. But he was smiling, shaking hands, the gracious host. He was wearing another impeccable suit, this one a dark charcoal that made him look both powerful and somehow vulnerable. The marks of his brush with death made him seem more human, more approachable. It was a lie. His eyes scanned the room, and then they landed on her. There was a moment of recognition, a slight widening. He excused himself from a group and started toward her. Chloe's breath hitched, every muscle in her body tensed. The speech she'd rehearsed, the accusations, the demands, they all evaporated, leaving a hollow, roaring silence in her head. He stopped before her, his smile warm, genuine. "You must be my guardian angel," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that was meant to be charming. It felt like a weapon. He took her hand, not to shake it, but to hold it between both of his. His hands were warm, smooth, no calluses, a world away from her own. "I can't tell you how long I've been hoping to meet you, to thank you properly." He looked directly at her, and the most devastating thing of all happened. There was not a single flicker of recognition in his eyes, no shadow of guilt, no dawning horror. He saw a waitress, a kind-hearted stranger, a story of heroism. He did not see Eleanor Edison's daughter. He did not see the ghost of the hardware store. He had gutted. The man who had orchestrated the destruction of her father's life looked at her and saw only his own salvation. The sheer, casual oblivion of it was a violence worse than any intentional cruelty. "It was nothing," she heard herself say, her voice a thin, strained thing that didn't sound like her own. "Anyone would have done the same." "But they didn't," he said, his gaze intense, sincere. "You did. You saved my life. I am in your debt." The words were meant to be gracious, but they landed on her like drops of acid. His debt? His debt was her father's broken spirit, her son's struggling breaths. He was charming, grateful, and utterly blind. He was offering gratitude to a ghost, never knowing he was staring his own ghost in the face. The opportunity to confront him died in her throat. What would be the point? He wouldn't even know what she was talking about. Her family's tragedy was so insignificant to him, it hadn't even left a mark on his memory. She was standing in the belly of the beast, and the beast didn't even know it had eaten her alive. The dinner was a surreal, slow-motion torture conducted with sterling silver cutlery and impeccable manners. Chloe was seated to Alexander Vance's right, a place of honor that felt like being strapped into an electric chair. The table was a lake of polished dark wood, reflecting the soft glow of a minimalist crystal chandelier. Each place setting was a complex array of glasses and utensils she had to subtly watch others to use correctly. The food was art. Tiny, exquisite courses that appeared and vanished, each more unidentifiable and expensive than the last. It was fuel for a body she felt had left hers, leaving behind a hollow, trembling shell going through the motions. Conversation flowed around her, a river of polished small talk about markets, art auctions, and vacations in places Chloe had only seen in magazines. She remained mostly silent, a spectator to a play in a language she didn't speak. Vance, however, was determined to draw her in. "I still can't get over your composure that night," he said, turning to her during a lull. The attention of the table shifted to her. "The paramedic said your quick thinking with the head wound likely prevented a far worse outcome. Where did you learn to act like that under pressure?" Every word of praise was a tiny, precise incision. She forced a tight smile. "Just a first aid course. A long time ago." She didn't say it was her father who'd insisted she take it, back when he still believed in being prepared for anything. "Well, it's more than most would have done," he continued, and the table murmured in agreement. "In my line of work, you see a lot of people freeze. True decisiveness is a rare commodity." He said it like he was complimenting a valuable business acquisition. The word work sent a fresh jolt of acid through her veins. She saw the hardware store's shelves being emptied, the "everything must go" sign, then comma. A small voice piped up from across the table. "Did it hurt when you climbed down?" It was his daughter, Emily. She was maybe 8, with her father's dark hair and a sprinkling of freckles across her nose. She looked at Chloe with wide, earnest eyes, her dinner forgotten. The question, so simple and direct, shattered the polished surface of the evening. For the first time, Chloe was looking at a person, not an accessory. "It was mostly just muddy," Chloe said, her voice softening despite itself, "and very cold." "Daddy said you talked to him," Emily pressed, unaware of the tension she was unraveling. "He said he could hear you, and it helped him not be so scared." Chloe's eyes flickered to Vance. He was watching his daughter, his expression unguarded, filled with a naked, overwhelming love that was the most real thing in the room. This was his vulnerability. This bright, innocent girl was the core of him, the one thing that existed outside the spreadsheets and the cold calculations. The fury inside Chloe wavered. To unleash her truth here, to spew the story of her father's ruin across this perfect table. It wouldn't just wound Vance. It would terrify this child. It would tarnish the image of her hero father with a story she was too young to understand. The justice Chloe craved would feel in this moment like cruelty. So she swallowed the bitter pill of her history and gave the little girl a genuine, if sad, smile. "I just told him he had to be strong, that he had people waiting for him." She looked directly at Emily. "He told me all about you." Emily beamed, a radiant, gap-toothed thing that could have power-washed the mud from Chloe's shoes that night. "I'm glad you found him." The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of excruciating politeness. Chloe navigated it like a ghost, haunting her own life, listening to Vance talk about streamlining operations and maximizing asset potential, phrases she now knew were euphemisms for destruction. Each one was a knife twist, a reminder of the cold, clinical language that had masked the end of her father's world. Finally, the evening drew to a close. The other guests drifted away with more handshakes and air kisses, leaving Chloe alone. In the vast living room with Vance, the silence after their departure was immense. He walked over to her, his posture less formal now, more reflective. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice quiet. "And for talking to Emily. She's been very worried." He looked out the window at his kingdom of lights, then back. At her, his gaze thoughtful. "I couldn't help but notice, and please forgive me if I'm overstepping." He gestured vaguely, a gesture that seemed to take in her simple dress, her worn clutch, her entire struggling existence. "It seems like life has been a challenge for you." Chloe's spine stiffened. Here it came, the pity, the condescension. But his next words weren't what she expected. "That kind of decisiveness I saw in you, that calm under fire, it's not something you can teach. It's invaluable." He took a step closer, his expression earnest. I have an opening at my company, an entry-level position in operations. It's not glamorous, but it's a foot in the door, a chance to get on your feet. The offer hung in the air between them, monstrous in its irony. It was everything she needed: a steady paycheck, health insurance, a lifeline thrown directly from the hand of the man who had pushed her overboard. It felt like the most profound insult imaginable, a trap baited with her own desperation, to work for him, to walk into the belly of the beast every day, to profit from the very machine that had crushed her family. But as she looked at him, at the man who saw her only as a project, a charity case to be managed and incorporated into his world, a cold, hard clarity settled over her. He was offering her a chance to get close, to really see the machine from the inside. She looked at him, her face a carefully constructed mask of overwhelmed gratitude. "A job," she whispered, letting her voice tremble just slightly. He smiled, a benevolent king bestowing a favor. "A fresh start." She held his gaze, the ghost of Edison's hardware screaming silently behind her eyes. "Thank you," she said, the words ash in her mouth. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll start on Monday," he replied, clapping her gently on the shoulder. The deal was done. The days between the offer and Monday morning were a special kind of purgatory. Chloe's rational mind screamed at her in a constant, deafening loop. This is a betrayal. This is insanity. You cannot walk into the lion's den and ask for a job. Every fiber of her being, every memory of her father's defeated posture, revolted at the idea. It felt like a spiritual surrender, a pact made with the devil himself, the price of which would be her very soul. But then reality would intrude, cold and unyielding. The eviction notice with its stark, final deadline. The empty inhaler cartridge on Leo's nightstand. The calculator on her phone, the numbers never adding up, no matter how many times she pressed the buttons. The devil's bargain, it turned out, was only a bargain for those who had a choice. She had none. The lifeline Vance had thrown her was coated in poison, but it was the only one in the water. The self-loathing was a physical taste, metallic and sour, in the back of her throat, as she dressed on Monday morning. She'd bought a cheap, boxy blazer and slacks, a poor imitation of the sleek power wear she'd seen at the penthouse. She looked like a little girl playing dress-up, a pretender. She kissed Leo goodbye, her heart aching with a new layer of guilt, and took the bus downtown. The headquarters of Vance Holdings wasn't just a building, it was a statement. A towering spear of glass and steel that reflected the clouds, impenetrable and arrogant. It was a monument to the success that had been built on the rubble of 1,000 small dreams like her father's. Just standing before its soaring atrium felt like standing at the foot of a tomb. Entering was a visceral nightmare. The air inside was filtered, temperature-controlled, and smelled of money and floor polish. The lobby was a cavernous space of echoing marble, dotted with severe modern art that looked cold and uncomfortable. People moved through it with purpose, their footsteps clicking a rapid, important rhythm on the hard floor. They were all sharp angles, tailored clothes, and Bluetooth earpieces, speaking a language of acronyms and projections. She was ushered to the HR department, a process of forms, badges, and blandly delivered lectures on corporate policy. Her new badge felt like a brand against her chest. Chloe Edison, operations associate, the name of her father's store, now a line on a Vance Holdings employee roster. The irony was a knife twisting deeper with every step. Her cubicle on the 30th floor was a grey fabric-walled cell, one of dozens in a vast open-plan sea. It was sterile, impersonal, and looked out through a glass wall into the corner offices where the real decisions were made. She was a cog, placed at the furthest edge of the machine. Her new colleagues were a study in polite, frozen hostility. They knew who she was, The story of the waitress who'd saved the CEO and gotten a job out of pity had circulated with the efficiency of a corporate memo. Their smiles didn't reach their eyes. Their welcomes were perfunctory. She was an outsider, a charity case, a living reminder that meritocracy was a myth. She hadn't earned her place through an Ivy League degree or years of ruthless maneuvering. She'd earned it by being in the right place during a rainstorm. They resented her, and they made no effort to hide it. "You'll be shadowing Melissa." "Today," a bored-looking manager said, not even making eye contact. "She'll show you the procurement software. Try to keep up." The work was soul-crushingly dull, processing invoices, cross-referencing shipping manifests, updating spreadsheets, with mind-numbing minutiae. But it was also a constant, agonizing education. Every report she filed, every purchase order she processed was a tiny thread in the vast, intricate web of Vance's empire. She saw the cold, brutal efficiency of it, the relentless pursuit of the bottom line, the way small, independent suppliers were slowly squeezed out for larger, cheaper conglomerates. She saw the ghost of her father's store in every line item. And everywhere she looked, there he was, Alexander Vance. His portrait hung in the lobby, his vision statements were plastered on the walls. His name was on every email, every memo, every piece of branding. He was a god in this glass temple, and she was forced to worship at his altar 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. She watched him once, through the glass wall of a conference room. He was leading a meeting, commanding the room with an easy, magnetic authority. He was talking about synergies and market disruption. He laughed at something someone said, a warm, genuine sound that didn't match the cold words on the flip chart behind him. In that moment, the hatred wasn't a hot burn anymore. It was something colder, harder, and more durable. It was a deep freeze of loathing that settled into her bones. She didn't just hate him for the past. She hated him for the present, for the casual way he owned this world, for the way he could smile and laugh while the machinery he built systematically dismantled lives, for the fact that he could look directly at her, the daughter of a man he'd destroyed, and see only a useful, grateful employee. She was trapped in the devil's bargain, selling pieces of her dignity every day for her son's health, and each day the man she was beginning to hate more than she thought possible was right there, in the corner office, reminding her exactly who held the leash. The charity case was put to work. A directive, it seemed, had come from the very top: integrate the new operations associate into the strategic workflow. Chloe was plucked from her grey cubicle and dropped into the orbit of Alexander Vance himself. She became a junior note-taker in high-level meetings, a ghost at the feast of corporate power, tasked with compiling reports that would land directly on his desk. It was a proximity that was both a curse and a perverse education. She was forced to witness his mind at work, and it was a terrifyingly brilliant thing. In meetings, he could dissect a complex financial report in seconds, pinpointing a single weak assumption on page 40 that unraveled an entire proposal. He saw patterns in market data that others missed, making intuitive leaps that felt less like logic and more like sorcery. He was charismatic, commanding the room not through intimidation, but through the sheer, undeniable force of his intellect. He could weave a vision of the future so compelling that people would willingly follow him into the unknown. Chloe watched. Seasoned executives, men and women twice her age with decades of experience, leaned forward, hanging on his every word, their faces alight with a near-religious fervor. This was the engine of the empire that had crushed her father. It wasn't just cold, it was dazzlingly, efficiently cold. And then she saw the ruthlessness. It happened during a quarterly review. A division manager was presenting a disappointing forecast. The man was sweating, his voice tight as he outlined a plan for a turnaround, for reinvestment, for patience. Vance listened, his expression neutral, his fingers steepled. When the man finished, there was a long, heavy silence. "Your commitment to your team is admirable, David," Vance said, his voice calm, almost gentle. "But sentiment is a luxury. We can't afford this quarter. The numbers are the numbers." He then laid out a counter-proposal. It was a thing of chilling, surgical precision. A 15% reduction in force. The shuttering of 2 underperforming regional branches. The outsourcing of customer service. Each point was delivered not with malice, but with the dispassionate logic of a mathematician solving an equation. Human beings became head count. Lives disrupted were redundancies eliminated. It was the same clinical, bloodless language. She remembered from the letters that had bled her father's store dry. Chloe's pen froze over her notepad. She felt the blood drain from her face. She was watching it happen again, in real time. The man from her memories was right in front of her, hiding behind a spreadsheet dot, but the universe, it seemed, was determined to break her. Just an hour later, back in his office, she witnessed the other man. His desk phone lit up with a specific, blinking line. His entire demeanor shifted. The formidable CEO vanished. His shoulders relaxed. A soft, genuine smile touched his lips. A smile she had only seen him direct at his daughter Dot, he answered, putting the call on speaker as he continued to scan a document. "Hey, Sweet Pea, how was math?" Emily's voice, bright and clear, filled the luxurious office. "I got a B+ on the quiz, but Sarah said my new sneakers are weird." Vance chuckled, a warm, rumbling sound. "Sarah's just jealous because she doesn't have sneakers that can light up the whole playground. Are they still blue?" "Yep, still blue." He remembered the color of her sneakers. In the middle of overseeing a corporate downsizing that would shatter dozens of families, he remembered the specific shade of his daughter's shoes, Dot. He ended the call with a soft, "Love you, kiddo. Tell Mrs. Peterson I said hello." He hung up, and the CEO mask settled back into place. But the warmth around his eyes remained for a few seconds longer, Dot. It was a whiplash that left Chloe morally dizzy. The same afternoons were punctuated by these calls. He'd exit a meeting where he'd just eviscerated a supplier for a 2% price hike, then step into the hall and have a 5-minute conversation with Emily about the urgent need for a specific type of glitter for a school project. He remembered the names of his low-level employees' children. He asked the janitor about his wife's recovery from surgery. These weren't grand, performative gestures. They were small, consistent, and seemingly genuine, Dot. The contradiction was a torture device. It would have been easier if he were a cartoon villain, rubbing his hands together with glee at others' misfortune. Pure evil was a simple thing to hate. But this was a man capable of breathtaking coldness and seemingly authentic warmth. A man who could terminate a department with one hand and personally ensure his assistant got paid leave for her maternity leave with the other. Dot, her clear, burning desire for revenge, began to muddy, clouded by a frustrating, unwelcome complexity. Was he a monster? Or was he just a man so compartmentalized that he could section off his humanity, turning it on for his daughter and his inner circle and off for the rest of the world? Was the ruthless CEO the real man and the good father, a carefully constructed persona, or was it the other way around? Her anger, once a sharp, clean blade pointed directly at his heart, now felt blunted, confused. She'd come here to expose a monster, but the monster kept showing her glimpses of a man. It felt like a betrayal of her father's memory to even entertain the thought. How could she hate him effectively when he remembered the janitor's wife's name? How could she plot her revenge when he looked so human, sitting there with his daughter's glitter dilemma on his mind? The facade was cracking, but not in the way she'd expected. It wasn't his facade that was splitting apart. It was hers. The simple, righteous anger that had sustained her was fracturing, revealing a confusing, painful mess of conflict underneath. The path to revenge was no longer a straight line. It was a maze, and she was losing her way inside it. The file landed on her desk with a soft, insignificant thud. It was just another manila folder in a stack of them, but this one had a title that made the air leave her lungs. Project Phoenix, Acquisition Analysis for Hearth and Home Hardware. Jane, her fingers were numb as she opened it. The contents were a gut punch of déjà vu. There were financial statements, property assessments, demographic analyses, but it was the proposed strategy document that turned her blood to ice. It was a carbon copy, a ghost from her past. The language was slicker, the fonts modern, but the brutal surgical steps were identical. Phase 1. Leverage property lease vulnerabilities of target assets. She remembered the mysterious, sudden problems with their building's plumbing, the safety inspections that always found new, expensive violations. Phase 2. Apply pressure to supply chain partners to create operational friction. She saw her father on the phone, his face confused and then desperate, as long-time suppliers suddenly couldn't fulfill orders for basic stock. Phase 3. Initiate a localized marketing campaign positioning Target as outdated and overpriced. The flyers that had appeared in mailboxes, comparing their prices unfairly to big box stores. Phase 4. Make a lowball acquisition offer once localized economic distress is maximized. The final humiliating offer that had broken her father's spirit. It was all here, not as a malicious plot, but as a corporate playbook, a standardized, repeatable process. Project Phoenix. The irony of the name was acid. It wasn't about rebirth. It was about circling a dying company, picking its bones clean, and using the ashes to fuel Vance Holdings' own rise. Chloe sat at her desk, the hum of the office fading into a distant buzz. She wasn't looking at a business proposal. She was reading her father's obituary. She saw his face not in a photograph, but in the lines of a spreadsheet. His life's work, his pride, his hope. It was all reduced to columns of numbers on a page, a line item for brand value, a cell for projected synergy savings, a footnote about redundant personnel. The revelation that crashed over her was not one of anger, but of a devastating, soul-crushing emptiness. It was so much worse than she had ever imagined. It wasn't personal. Alexander Vance hadn't woken up one morning and decided to destroy Frank Edison out of spite, or some specific vendetta. Her father wasn't a nemesis, he was an obstacle. His store wasn't a cherished community institution, it was an underperforming asset. Their tragedy wasn't a story, it was a business strategy that had been successfully executed. He hadn't hated her father. He probably hadn't even thought about her father beyond the confines of that particular deal. He was simply playing a game, a complex, high-stakes game of financial chess, and her family had been a pawn he'd captured and removed from the board. The game had simply continued, and now he was setting up the same play against another family, another father, another dream. The coldness of it was absolute. It was a void more terrifying than any hatred. Hatred, at least, acknowledged your existence. This was just nothing. A void. Her family's pain, their loss, their years of struggle, it was all just statistical noise in the glorious upward trajectory of Vance Holdings' profit margin. She looked up from the file, her vision blurring. She saw her colleagues at their desks, typing, chatting, sipping coffee. They were all part of this machine. They were the gears turning, executing Phase 1 and Phase 2 without a second thought, because it was just business. It was just a game, and they were all playing to win. She had been playing too. She'd been collecting her paychecks, using the health insurance, telling herself she was gathering information, waiting for the right moment to strike. But in doing so, she had become complicit. Her silence was consent. Her presence in this Working for this man, was a validation of his entire world. She was helping to oil the very machine that was now gearing up to crush another hearth and home. The conflict, the confusion about the man who loved his daughter and remembered. His employees' names, it evaporated. That man was a luxury he allowed himself. The real man was the one in this document, the game player, and in his game, people were not people. They were assets and liabilities. They were moves and counter-moves. A cold, clear certainty solidified. Within her, hardening like diamond, she could not do this. She could not be a part of this. She could not sit in her grey cubicle and quietly compile the report that would sign the death warrant for another family dream. The desire for personal revenge was gone, burned away by a brighter, more urgent fire. The need to stop it. To act. Not for her father's memory, but for the family out there right now, who had no idea the machine was already turning toward them. She closed the file. Her hands were steady. The moral maze was gone. There was only one path forward, and it led directly through Alexander Vance. The cafe was his suggestion, but the meeting was her demand. She'd sent a single, terse email. "We need to talk, not at the office, somewhere neutral." He'd replied within minutes with the name and address of a quiet, upscale spot. Likely. Assuming it was about a raise, a transfer, perhaps a personal problem she needed help with. The benevolent king, dispensing favors. This time, Chloe did not wear the cheap blazer. She wore her own clothes, simple, clean, and entirely hers. She arrived early, choosing a table in the back, away from the window. She ordered nothing. She simply sat, her hands folded on the table, waiting. The air smelled of expensive coffee and baked goods, a stark contrast to the antiseptic, filtered atmosphere of his world. When he arrived, he moved through the space with his usual easy authority, offering a brief, charming smile to the hostess before spotting Chloe. He looked, slightly puzzled but unconcerned. He slid into the chair opposite her, his large frame making it seem small. "Chloe, is everything all right?" "This seems rather clandestine for a Tuesday morning," he said, his tone light, almost amused. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She simply looked at him, and for the first time, she made no effort to hide the coldness in her eyes. The pretense was over. "My name," she began, her voice low and steady, devoid of any employee deference, "is Chloe Edison. My father was Frank Edison. He owned Edison's hardware on Elm Street. The change in the air was immediate and profound. The casual ease on his face froze, then slowly began to dissolve. The name meant something. Not a lot. Not everything. But something. She saw it. The flicker of distant recognition in his eyes, the slight tightening of his jaw. He was searching his mental files. She didn't give him time to find them. She began to speak, calmly and methodically, laying out the story not as an accusation, but as a simple, devastating chronology. She described the store in its heyday, the smell of cut wood and coffee, the bell on the door, the way her father knew every customer by name. She talked about the first offer from Vance Holdings, her father's polite refusal. Then, she detailed the siege, the unfortunate lease renegotiations, the mysterious supply chain disruptions, the comparative advertising flyers that appeared in every mailbox in the neighborhood. She didn't raise her voice. She recited the facts like a prosecutor presenting evidence, each one a brick in a wall she was building between them. She told him about the final offer, the one that was a fraction of the store's worth, made when they had no other options left. She described the sound of the lock clicking shut for the last time. And then she told him about the aftermath, the silence in their house, the way the light went out of her father's eyes, the long, slow slide into a depression from which he never truly emerged. She spoke of his death not as a dramatic event, but as a quiet, final surrender, years in the making. She watched his face. Through it all, she saw the recognition solidify into a deep, unsettling disquiet. Then came the dawning horror. Not horror at what had been done, but horror at being confronted with it. Horror that this forgotten minor acquisition from years ago had walked back into his life with a face and a story. His defenses went up instantly. The CEO, the strategist, took over. He held up a hand, his voice taking on the patient, explaining. Tone he might use with a junior analyst who didn't understand a complex market force. Chloe, that was a long time ago. The retail landscape was changing. Small independent stores like your father's, they were becoming economically unviable. It was a consolidation. The offer we made, I'm sure it was a fair market valuation at the time. The words were like gasoline on the cold fire inside her. Economically unviable, consolidation, fair market valuation. He was still speaking the language of the spreadsheet. He was trying to translate her father life into a column of data. A fair market valuation? She repeated, her voice dangerously soft. For his life's work, for his pride, for his will to get up in the morning. What's the market value for that, Mr. Vance? Can you pull that number for me? What line item is that under? He flinched. The corporate armor cracked. I understand you're upset. You feel a personal connection to this, but you have to see the larger picture. The larger picture. She cut him off, the calm beginning to fracture, allowing a sliver of raw pain to show through. The larger picture is that you didn't just buy a business, you broke a man. You took everything he had built and you treated it like a problem to be solved. And you solved it. You were brilliant, and he was just the collateral damage. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. You looked me in the eye in your penthouse and you told me you were in my debt. You had no idea the depth of a debt if you could never repay it. Because you weren't there to see the interest accrue. You weren't there every night when he just sat in his chair, staring at the wall. You didn't have to learn the sound of a dream dying. Vance opened his mouth to speak, to justify, to defend, but no sound came out. The practiced phrases, the boardroom logic, they all died before they reached his lips. He was not facing a disgruntled employee or a competitor. He was facing the human consequence of his game. And the consequence had a name and a face and a cold, unwavering gaze. He looked down at his hands, then around the cafe, as if seeing the real world for the first time. The confidence, the charm, the effortless authority. It all drained away, leaving behind a man who looked suddenly older and unnervingly vulnerable. The disconnect between his actions and their results was finally violently bridged. He had no words, no defense. The spreadsheet had no column for this. The silence that stretched between them was thick and absolute. It was the silence of a worldview cracking apart. Chloe had not shouted. She had not wept. She had simply borne witness. And in doing so, she had handed him the mirror and forced him to look. He just sat there, stunned into a profound and terrible silence. The silence in the cafe stretched, thick and suffocating. Finally, Chloe pushed her chair back, the legs scraping against the tile floor with a sound that was far too loud in the quiet room. Alexander Vance didn't look up. He remained frozen, staring at the table as if he could see the ghost of Frank Edison sitting between them. I quit, she said. The words were simple, clean and absolute. There was no anger left in them, only a final, exhausted certainty. She expected a reaction, a cold dismissal, a threat, a reminder of the non-disclosure agreements she'd signed. But he said nothing. He gave no indication he'd even heard her. He was lost in a storm of his own making, and she had just walked out of the eye of it. She left him there, a powerful man reduced to a statue in a quiet cafe. She walked out into the daylight, half expecting to be met by security, to be escorted from the building one final time. But nothing happened. The city buzzed around her, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred in a back-corner coffee shop. The following days were an anxious blur. Every ring of her phone, every email notification made her jump. She waited for the other shoe to drop, for the blacklist, for a lawsuit, for the formidable machinery of Vance Holdings to grind into motion and crush her for her audacity. She spent hours staring at her bank account balance, the numbers a terrifyingly small defense against the world. The fear was a constant low hum, fear of retaliation, fear of financial ruin, fear that she had made a catastrophic error for a moment of moral clarity. But nothing came. The silence from Vance Holdings was more unnerving than any threat would have been. Meanwhile, in his penthouse high above the city, Alexander Vance had gone to ground. Meetings were cancelled, emails went unanswered. The relentless engine of his corporation idled, confused by the sudden absence of its driver. He stood before his wall of windows, but the glittering skyline he commanded no longer looked like an empire. It looked like a graveyard. Every shining tower, every successful venture suddenly seemed to have an invisible foundation built on stories like Chloe's, on the ruins of Edison's hardware, and who knew how many others. The compulsion was morbid, irresistible. He had his assistant pull the file. Not the digitized, sanitized version in the company archives, but the physical paper file from the storage annex. The Edison's hardware acquisition. It arrived in a dusty cardboard box. Inside were the cold, hard facts he remembered. The property assessments, the financial projections, the strategy memos. He had signed off on them all. They were brilliant, efficient, profitable. But buried beneath them were other things, things his analysts had filtered out, things he'd never seen. A local newspaper clipping, photocopied, about the store's closing, quoting a few disappointed loyal customers. A handwritten letter from Frank Edison himself, a plea for reconsideration, for more time, written in a firm, proud script that had doubtless been ignored and filed away by a junior executive. A grainy photo from a town fair, the store's banner visible in the background, Frank Edison serving hot dogs at a grill, smiling. He wasn't just reading a file anymore. He was reading an obituary. He saw the dates. He calculated the time between the store's closing and Frank Edison's death. It wasn't a long time. He saw the name of the surviving relative, Eleanor Chloe Edison. The human cost, which had always been an abstract concept, a risk factor to be mitigated, now had a face. It was the face of the woman who had held his hand in the mud. The woman who had refused his money, the woman who had looked at him with a cold fury born of grief. He now finally understood. He had seen himself as a master of the game. But Chloe hadn't been playing a game. She had been fighting for her father's memory, and she had won. Not by beating him, but by showing him the score. And the score was written in the hollows of a dead man's eyes and the stubborn pride of his daughter. Down in her small apartment, Chloe felt the constant anxious hum begin to quiet. The fear of retaliation was slowly replaced by a fragile, burgeoning sense of peace. The weight was gone. The secret she had carried into that glass tower, the anger she had been forced to swallow every day, was out. She had told her truth to the one person who needed to hear it. She had nothing left to hide. She was broke. The future was a terrifying question mark. But for the first time since she'd taken his job, she could look at her reflection without seeing a traitor staring back. She had chosen her father over the paycheck. She had chosen truth over complicity. The financial walls were closing in, but her soul, for the first time in a very long time, had room to breathe. The knock on the door was wrong. It wasn't the brisk official rap of the landlord. It wasn't the cheerful, familiar pattern of a neighbor. It was hesitant, almost timid, 3 soft, uncertain taps that seemed to apologize for their own existence. Chloe's heart still wired from weeks of anxiety, gave a nervous jolt. She peered through the peephole, expecting to see a process server or a building manager. The figure she saw on the other side of the distorted fisheye lens made her breath catch in her throat. Alexander Vance stood in the dim, fluorescent light of the hallway. He was alone. There was no sharp-suited assistant, no driver waiting by a town car downstairs. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore dark jeans and a simple navy pullover, clothes that looked strangely ordinary on him, like a king in disguise. He looked smaller outside his penthouse, his office, his car. He looked real and deeply uncomfortable. For a long moment, Chloe considered not answering. She could just stand there, silent, and he would eventually go away. The world of Alexander Vance and the world of her cramped apartment were not meant to intersect. But the hesitation in his knock held her. It wasn't a demand. It was a request. She unchained the door and opened it a few inches. She didn't speak. She just looked at him, her expression guarded, a question in her eyes. He met her gaze, and his own was stripped of all its usual power. There was no charm, no calculation, no CEO magnetism. There was only a raw, unsettling honesty. "Chloe," he said, his voice quieter than she'd ever heard it. "May I come in?" It was the "may I" that undid her. It was a word of permission, of deference she doubted he used often. She stepped back, opening the door wider, and he crossed the threshold into her world. He didn't try to hide his reaction. His eyes took in the small, worn space, the second-hand sofa, the kitchenette with its chipped counter, the photos of Leo on the fridge. He wasn't judging it. He was absorbing it. He was seeing the reality of her life, the life his actions had helped shape. The silence was heavy but not hostile. He didn't sit. He just stood in the middle of the living room, looking lost. He shoved his hands into the pockets of his jeans. "I'm not here to make excuses," he began, his voice low and rough, like he hadn't used it in days. "There aren't any that matter." He took a breath, a shaky thing. "I read the file. The whole file." He looked at her then, and his eyes were haunted. "I am but sorry for what was done to your father, to your family, to you." The apology hung in the air between them. It wasn't polished, it wasn't eloquent, it was clumsy and stumbling, ripped from somewhere deep inside him that had long been buried under layers of deals and acquisitions. It was the first apology of his life that wasn't a strategic maneuver, a calculated part of a negotiation. It was just an apology, and its sheer, unvarnished genuineness was more disarming than any amount of rage or justification could ever have been. He continued, his words coming faster now, as if he needed to get them all out. "I stopped it, the Hearth and Home acquisition. I shut down Project Phoenix entirely." Chloe felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. She had wanted to stop it, but she never truly believed she could. He looked around her apartment again, at the evidence of her struggle, and then back at her. "You were right. It's just a game to people like me. It's a game I'm very good at playing. But you—" He shook his head, a look of profound respect on his face. "You don't play games. You looked at me, the CEO of the company that signs your paycheck, and you told me I was wrong." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "No one has done that in 20 years. Everyone in my life is paid to agree with me or to tell me what I want to hear. You were the only person with the courage to look me in the eye and tell me the truth." He hadn't come to offer her job back. He hadn't come with a check to try and settle the debt again. He had come for one reason only, to stand in the world he had helped create for her and to offer the only thing that might possibly mean anything, a raw, unqualified admission of fault. He had come because she had done the one thing his money and power could never command. She had made him see himself, and he knew that an email or a phone call would be just another move in the game. This, standing in her living room, exposed and vulnerable, was the only thing that wasn't. The silence in the small apartment stretched, thick with the weight of his apology. It wasn't an absolution. It was an atom bomb that had vaporized the landscape between them, leaving nothing but bare, scorched earth. Chloe could only stare at him, trying to reconcile the man in the faded pullover with the titan in the glass tower. He didn't retreat from the silence. He stood in it, letting it be, accepting it as his due. When he spoke again, his voice was clearer, more purposeful, as if the apology had cleared a blockage. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," he said, his gaze steady on hers. "That isn't mine to ask for. And I'm not here to offer you a job back. That would be an insult." He took a slow breath, choosing his words with a care she had never seen from him. "What was taken from your father, from you, was a chance. The chance to build something yourself, to put your name on the deed and know it was yours." He glanced at the photo of Leo on the fridge, then back to her. "I can't give you back those years, but I can try to give you that chance." He paused, letting the proposition hang in the air. It wasn't a plea. It was a statement of intent. "I want to provide the capital for you to start your own business. Not a handout, an investment." He quickly held up a hand, anticipating her refusal. "It wouldn't be from me, not personally. It would be from a new venture fund, one I'm establishing." He began to pace slowly, a caged tiger in her small living room. But the energy was different now, not restless, but focused. This fund wouldn't be for tech startups or market disruption. Its sole purpose would be to identify and invest in entrepreneurs like your father. People with skill, passion, and a dream who have been pushed out or overlooked by the conventional system. People who need a chance, not a takeover. He stopped and turned to face her fully, his expression intense, earnest. "The fund needs a director, someone who can spot real potential, not just profit margins. Someone who understands the human cost of getting it wrong. Someone with a conscience." He let the word hang there. "I've never had one, not a real one. I need a partner who does." This was the offer, not a check for her silence, not a pity job. It was something far more dangerous, more radical, and more terrifying. "You want me to run it?" The words felt absurd coming out of her mouth. "I want you to be it," he corrected, his voice firm. "Its heart, its compass. I'll handle the capital, the legal structure, the things I know how to do. You will decide who gets a chance. You will define what success looks like. It won't be about maximum returns. It will be about building something that lasts, something that means something." He was offering her a seat at the table, not as a supplicant, but as an equal, a partner. He was handing her the keys to a part of his empire and asking her to rebuild it in a new image. He wasn't trying to fix a single mistake. He was trying to fix the very machine that had made the mistake possible. "This isn't charity, Chloe," he said, his tone becoming almost stern, as if he were warning her. "It's a business proposition. I'm investing in you. I'm investing in your integrity, your courage, and your eye for what truly matters. I believe it's a sound investment." He was giving her a way to honor her father that wasn't about vengeance. It was about creation. It was a chance to build a legacy for Leo that was about empowerment, not loss. It was a chance to ensure that other families wouldn't have their stories end like hers almost had. It was not forgiveness, not. It was something more powerful. A partnership forged in the brutal honesty of what they had done to each other. He had shown her the devastating cost of his ruthlessness. She had shown him the transformative power of her truth. Now, he was offering to merge those two forces into something new. He was offering her a chance to be the conscience he never had. And in doing so, he was taking his first stumbling step toward building one of his own. Sunlight, real and warm, streamed through the windows of Chloe's office. It wasn't a corner office with a city panorama, and it wasn't a grey fabric cubicle. It was a space in a renovated brick building with a view of a bustling, tree-lined street below. The walls were painted a soft, warm grey, and on them hung a large framed photograph of Edison's hardware in its prime, and a child's brightly coloured drawing of a rocket ship labelled "Mommy's Work" in wobbly crayon dot on her desk. Next to a sleek computer monitor stood two photos. One was of her father Frank, his smile forever captured in a moment of unburdened pride. The other was of Leo, his cheeks full and healthy, holding up a science fair ribbon, his smile wide, and his breathing easy. Chloe was on a video call, her posture relaxed but engaged. "The key isn't to match their prices, Maria," she was saying, her voice calm and sure. "It's to highlight what they can't offer. Your knowledge, your community roots, the custom fittings, that's your value." On the screen, a woman, in her 50s, the owner of a small specialty shoe store, nodded vigorously, her earlier anxiety replaced by dawning confidence. "You're right. Of course, you're right. I just get so nervous when I see their ads." "Turn their size into your story," Chloe said with a warm smile. "You're not a chain. You're a destination. We believe in that. The fund believes in that." The door to her office opened without a knock. Alexander Vance walked in, holding a tablet. He was back in his suits, but the armor seemed less impenetrable here. He gestured apologetically for interrupting, but Chloe waved him in. "I have to go, Maria. Send me the revised business plan by Friday. You've got this." She ended the call and turned to him, one eyebrow raised. "You have that look, the I'm about to question a core principle of the fund look." He offered a half smile, a genuine one that reached his eyes. "The numbers on the artisanal bakery in Portland, their flour cost is 30% higher than the model projected. The ROI timeline is stretching. Their flour is sourced from a collective of sustainable local farms," Chloe replied without missing a beat. "That's not a line item, Alex. That's their brand. That's the point," he sighed. But it was a sound of fond exasperation, not dismissal. He leaned against her desk, looking down at the tablet. "It's a risk." "It's the right risk," she countered. "Or, did you forget the point of this whole expensive experiment? Their relationship was a constant, respectful challenge. He was the strategist, the numbers man, always pushing for efficiency, for scale. She was the conscience, the compass, relentlessly pulling them back to the human element, to the why. They argued, they debated. He frustrated her with his cold calculations. She frustrated him with her stubborn idealism, but the arguments were built on a foundation of brutal, shared history. They had seen the worst of each other, and instead of walking away, they had chosen to build something new from the wreckage. He was not her boss. He was her partner, a sometimes infuriating, often brilliant, and always necessary partner. "Fine," he conceded, swiping the report away. "The flour stays, but talk to them about a customer loyalty program that highlights the farm story. Let's get the customers to buy into the why and justify the cost." A smile touched Chloe's lips. It was a classic Vance compromise, finding a strategic way to achieve a moral goal. "Now that is a good idea," he nodded, pushed off the desk and headed for the door. "Don't forget, we have the board call at 3. They want an update on the social impact metrics." He said the phrase with a slight distaste. "I'll be there. I'll bring the charts that make your eyes glaze over." He chuckled as he left, closing the door softly behind him. The room settled back into quiet. Chloe swiveled her chair away from her desk, away from the photos of the past, and looked out her window. The sun was shining on the street below, on people living their lives, on small businesses opening their doors for another day. She wasn't looking out at the ruins of the past anymore. The ghost of Edison's hardware was finally at peace. She was looking at the foundation of the future. It was a future she had built herself, not from a place of anger, but from a place of strength, not to avenge her father, but to honor him. She had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and, with the most unlikely of partners, had used it to build something good. The past was a place of reference, not a place of residence. Her gaze was fixed firmly on the road ahead.